Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on wherever you may be joining us today. I'm happy to have a conversation with you on privacy. And when I was asked to present to you on privacy, many thoughts came to mind, and lots of ideas transit through the gray matter as I was putting together my thoughts and outline for our session. So today we're going to talk about privacy in a very broad sense, but we're also going to talk about the information governance maturity model, the reference model. We're also going to talk about privacy in different jurisdictions to some degree. But I want to start by talking about records and records defined. An example of records is defined in the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act in Alberta. States that a record means recorded information in any form. And as you can see from the slide, notes, images, audiovisual recordings, x-rays, books, documents, maps, drawings, photographs, letters, vouchers, and papers, and any other information that is written, photographed, recorded, or stored in any manner, but it doesn't include software or a mechanism that produces the records, which you have to ensure that you have if you have to produce records in a format that you have preserved them in. So for example, microfiche records, you still have to be able to provide those. Information can be information that is content, documents, records, knowledge, and as well as that overlap with data. So in terms of when we look at privacy as a whole and we look at protecting information that is private, we have to think about where that information is stored as well and in what format it's stored. Personal information is defined in the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act in Alberta, and I'll use that as an example of legislation. Means recorded information about an identifiable individual, and it's quite broad: an individual's name, home or business address, or home or business telephone number, individual's race, national or ethnic origin, color or religious or political beliefs, and so on. The individual's age, sex, marital status, or family status, and any identifying number, because that identifying number or symbol could be the key to a wealth of information about that person, and even if that's all you have about them to start with. So we're thinking here, protecting the privacy rights of the individual. We're also ensuring that in these days of extreme cyber threat risk out there, that we are making sure that those identifying numbers are also protected. Information about the individual's health and healthcare history, again, another piece of very relevant information these days with vaccination status, COVID tests, and exemption status, where that applies in terms of vaccinations. Information about the individual's educational, financial, employment, or other criminal history, including criminal records, and anyone else's opinions about the individual, and the individual's personal views and opinions, except they're about someone else. So as you can see, the personal information definition is quite broad, and I expect that as things progress through reviews and revisions to privacy legislation, that we may see that expanded. Examples of PII from other legislation, again, very similar to the previous description that I provided, but again, things like DNA. We have all these DNA tests that are provided these days and people sign up for them, but think of the wealth of information that is contained in DNA that you might want, or individuals whose data you have really want to keep protected. And again, back to some basic identifying numbers or symbols, social insurance number, or a driver's license number. ARMA International provides us with a lot of resources, graphics, and material that are really useful in the records management and records and information management realm, as well as on retention management and electronic records management as well. And again, going back to the intersection of the various domains that we work in as information governance professionals, if we are certified, or as information professionals, if we're not, that we need to pay attention to and to recall. And I use a playbook in my daily activities when I'm involved in privacy situations. We always want to take a look at the discipline that we're working in. Records management is a subdiscipline of information management, and divided into traditional paper and physical, as well as electronic and digital records management. And as we have been doing more and more of our processes in the electronic and digital world, especially since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, that we see the need to manage those records. And there's another article that I put together on managing records during COVID that has had to evolve as changes have taken place. In terms of privacy legislation, some privacy legislation was written some time ago, and that too is in the process of being looked at in certain jurisdictions. We also have new privacy legislation coming in. Examples of provincial and territorial laws exist in the provinces and territories across Canada. And most of us on this call, I believe, are from organizations that would be considered public bodies. And so I put this slide up to demonstrate that in Alberta, BC, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, Ontario, PEI, and Saskatchewan, you have FIPA type laws, or in Alberta, FOIP. And as we move across the country and look at the territories and Quebec, they've got their own legislation as well. One of the pieces that we want to consider too, as we think about privacy legislation, if you're not a public body and you are, for example, in Alberta, operating strictly in Alberta, you may be subject to PIPA if you're private sector. And as well, we have to think about the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA. We also have to consider the Digital Privacy Act as well. Now, one of the important things to know is which particular piece of legislation applies to you, and that will depend on if your organization operates as a public body and would be subject to FOIP type legislation, and if your organization operates your private sector OSFI regulated organization, you need to know what legislation applies to you and whether PIPEDA would apply to you. Other privacy legislation is evolving around the world, and there's some really good examples of changes that have taken place in privacy legislation around the world. A good example is the European Union's GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which has some significant fines and penalties associated where there's non-compliance. In the United States, there's so many different pieces of legislation that overlap, and also in some cases there may be no specific legislation that applies. As we do more and more cross-border activities, as we operate more in the digital world, we need to be cognizant of what legislation applies to us and to ensure we are compliant. I like to use the IGRM, the Information Governance Reference Model, to guide a lot of my activities at play, and by that I mean in the work that I do, and remembering that we exist to serve business in some sense, whether it's business of government or another private sector vertical. We remember to have the balance of the value we provide, as well as to ensure compliance and risk management, and to be very cognizant of cost as we operate. In terms of IT, creating that efficiency that helps us to all operate in a world that where every business is an IT business. as much as some organizations may still rely heavily on paper, there is certainly the need when working remotely to have digital access to make sure that that information is secure, that that information is protected again. And in terms of the interconnection with privacy, to make sure that when we consider privacy as well, we consider privacy as part of this whole wheel where the records and information management piece down in the bottom left-hand corner is all part of adding value to this as well as ensuring legal compliance. And back to, as we use this particular model, we have to protect the information that we receive. We may be collecting a lot of personally identifiable information, and to make sure that we are collecting it for a specific purpose that is legislatively authorized, that we are protecting it, that we are retaining it in a protected fashion, disposing of it in conjunction with retention schedules, and using it specifically for the manner in which it was collected. So again, going through the cycle here, this slide and this particular graphic helps in my playbook, in my day-to-day, to ensure that we're doing all these things, that we're considering all these things, and we haven't forgotten, all the way through to disposition, which can also include archiving and the rules involved with keeping certain types of data in an archives situation. The information governance core concepts, again, from ARMA International, give us a good demonstration of how these wheels fit together. And if you look at the privacy gear over in the middle left-hand side that tie into the IAM standards and principles in the IGP certification, the corporate and personal data will need to be protected, obviously. But again, we take a look at the wheel just up to the gear, just up to the left of that, the upper left above the privacy gear, and it talks about prevents hacking and information loss. And if one of these situations occurs, you have a cyber incident, a hacking event, a ransomware event, a phishing event that leads to much bigger consequences, having your ducks in a row will help to reduce or mitigate the risk. Having a plan in place is what to do prior to an event, a cyber event taking place is really important. As well, in terms of privacy, the wheel just below the privacy gear talks about ensuring regulatory compliance. So these are some of the tools that I use as part of my playbook. A couple other concepts that I think are important to discuss are PIAs and PIBs, privacy impact assessments, and personal information banks. So privacy impact assessments are really good tools for determining where changes to processes or new processes or new applications, systems that you bring into your organization may have gaps that could lead to breaches or disclosure of information when it's not properly protected. And some legislation requires that these be completed, especially in health situations. And in other situations, PIAs are recommended, and the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner may be interested in reviewing them and giving you some feedback. So PIAs also serve to document processes, and in terms of managing information and data, you can utilize a PIA to determine where data is going, how information is being collected, whether it's through systems, human systems, and your network infrastructure. Personal information banks should also be completed and able to be provided in certain contexts where an individual says, I want to know where you have my information. I would like to know what you have stored in your databases on me. I would like to know where my information is stored. So having that personal information bank available, and so you're able to provide at least where you have information stored, whether it's still in a spreadsheet that's hopefully password protected, or whether it's in databases that have good permissions and security, such as passwords or multi-factor authentication, to be able to say this is where we have your information. PIBs also serve as a PII inventory and a data inventory and add to the IM process. So by that I mean you need to know where your data is. You need to have an inventory of systems and databases that process, transit that information through your networks, and also the databases that the information is stored in. So these pieces all form part of the professional toolbox, and the information profession also encompasses privacy, as you'll see. So there is that interaction as well that takes place between the various sections in the various circles in the toolbox, the various parts of the spoken hub and spoke scenario here. So there's compliance with privacy legislation, of course. You're ensuring that records are kept as required by various pieces of legislation, that there's the correct security provided, archiving at the end of use of that particular record when it's met its retention, if the disposition process that you will follow is going to be archiving, or whether it's going to be destruction of the record. And as well, the information strategy for the organization needs to be part of ensuring that these parts of the hub and spoke model operate correctly. And as always, involving information technology professionals and legal professionals as well in working with your projects is very, very helpful. So that's the end of my brief presentation this morning, and I will make these resources available through Rick and Western IM. We'll provide some links as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about how the information governance maturity model and the principles of accountability, transparency, integrity, protection of information, which we've touched on briefly, compliance as well, availability of information, retention and disposition. And I bring up availability at the end here because one of the key components of legislation like FOIP, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, is also the availability of information, subject to certain exceptions. Information, if you're a public body, needs to be available to those who request it through, for example, a FOIP request. And as well, if you're in the private sector, you can also be required to provide information, again, subject to exceptions. So the information governance maturity model and the various principles that come from the ARMA originally created generally acceptable record-keeping principles are principles that figure into the entire process here and all fit together with the playbook to ensure that you're compliant with your privacy legislation and regulation.